And the classic case that Hoagland cites is the case of Surveyor 4, a little unmanned probe that the United States sent, I think it was in 1965-66, I don't recall the exact year. But this probe failed, and it failed in a most unusual manner. The telemetry from the probe was functioning perfectly. It had entered its retro-rocket burn, it was coming down to a soft landing on the moon, and then all of a sudden it entirely, completely disappeared.
Yeah.
And the reason that Hoagland gives is, if it had exploded or something of that sort, the telemetry data would still have been available to NASA, and we could have seen the process of destruction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But we see nothing. And his explanation is a rather ingenious one. As it's backing down on its retro rockets, it hits one of these structures. And in doing so, the antenna is knocked away, and the beam, the telemetry data, is instantaneously directed away from Earth. In other words, it's still there, but it's missing.
Okay.
And in backing down on one of these structures, it simply self-destructs. And that's why there's no telemetry data. And, this is the most plausible explanation I've found, not only for that probe, but for the fact that we never went back.
Yeah.
The only thing that the United States sent back to the moon, I think, was this little unmanned Clementine probe that the Pentagon, of all people, sent up during the Clinton administration. And then, of course, that disappears mysteriously. So I think that the ultimate reason is that NASA has known all along, and this, I think, is very conclusively demonstrated in his latest book, that there are some sorts of artificial structures on the moon, and that they have wanted to cover this up, and most likely the Russians have as well. And I think the game is afoot, because now, of course, the European Space Agency, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Indians have all declared that they're making the moon a principal target of their space effort. And, that kind of put the United States on the hot seat.
Yeah,
so,
it does.
This is the ultimate motivation, I think, for the Bush administration determining that, well, we better go back too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and that's fascinating, because there is also this idea about the, I think Hoagland actually calls it the other space program, basically.
Oh, yes.
And that, what was his name now? Paul Hellyer, the former Canadian defense minister, mentioned on a TV show that he learned about, ideas or that this is something that is going around, that they're constructing actually bases on the moon to actually guard against what he called rogue aliens, basically.
Right. Well, this whole idea of the two space programs hypothesis, as you recall from SS Brotherhood of the Bell, is something I think has been there, and I think that Mr. Hoagland would agree with this generalization. I think this two space programs track, if you will, has been there since World War II, because we see the Nazis pursuing conventional rockets, and yet we also see them pursuing a much more secret, much more hidden program to acquire very advanced field propulsion. So, if we factor that into what you're saying here, I think it's definitely the case that there has always been an aspect of at least the American space program, and by extension that would mean logically the Russians as well, and everybody else who has one, that there is some hidden covert technology that's enabling much more extensive exploration of the moon and nearby planetary bodies to occur.
Exactly. Wow, that's something to ponder upon, and the idea that they could even be. I've heard reports of. I can't remember his name now. I think it was actually one astronaut that referred this story, that they encountered something up there that actually, that they basically was warned. NASA, was warned off the moon and said that they were not welcome there.
I have heard similar things, and I forget the astronaut's name as well. I think it may have either been Brian O'Leary or perhaps
I think it was O'Leary. That's probably right.
It may have been someone like that, and I don't discount that, because the behavior, again, of the United States and the Soviet Union with respect to the moon is just very, very peculiar, and quite frankly, when we get down to the bottom line, it's inexplicable.
Yeah.
And again, I would suspect that the ultimate motivation for America's sudden interest in the moon again isn't really that we ever lost the interest. It's just because now the competition is much more extensive. It's certainly much more sophisticated in terms of the abilities of China or Europe or India or the Japanese to launch technology. I mean, after all, look at the American public program. We're still using the space shuttle.
Yeah.
This is a 30-year-old obsolescent technology.
Yeah.
In the meantime, the Japanese, the Europeans, the Russians have come up with some extraordinarily powerful, very sophisticated boosters. So, this has really, really put the United States, as I said before, in a hot seat as far as space matters go.
Yeah, exactly. And I saw a documentary with one guy from NASA, scientist, who now is working with development of different rockets and so forth. And he basically said in this documentary, I think it was History Channel or Discovery Channel, pretty, mainstream again, that he was basically amazed how they even managed to pull it off with the technology that they had available at the time. Again, implying the idea that there was some kind of split here, that the previous guys actually worked on NASA for some reason, left or they were fired or their knowledge was taken away in some way. And then when these new guys come in, they basically know, nothing.
Well, this is the other thing. At some point, I think NASA suffered tremendously from the loss of the paperclip Germans that we brought over here. Because if we look at the Russian space program, one of the interesting things that the Russians did that we did not do, and it's to the Russians' credit that they saw the dangers implicit in using and relying upon so many German technicians, and they literally had thousands of them that helped jumpstart their space program. But Sergei Korolev, who was really the mastermind, an administrative mastermind, he very quickly decided that he would use these German technicians to train their university students that were studying space matters to take over their role. So in other words, he set up kind of a space internship program very early on in the Russian program. And as a result, the Russians were able to free themselves from this Nazi influence in the mid-50s. And they literally repatriated a bunch of these people back to Germany. Mm-hmm. In the United States, we had far fewer of these German engineers. We certainly had the more brilliant ones. But as a result, we were left reliant upon them all throughout the Apollo period. And it's interesting that you mentioned this two-track idea, because I'd like to go back to something I think I may have mentioned in our last interview. And that is the presence of Dr. Kurt Davis as one of the administrators at the Kennedy Space Flight Center in the Apollo program. Mm-hmm. Davis was one of the chief scientists involved in the Bell project. In fact, he was the man that designed the power plant for the Bell.
Okay.
And he was also a member of von Braun's rocket team at Peenemünde. Hmm. Now, I find this interesting because he is not a rocket scientist at all. His specialty is in high voltage, direct current discharge measurement. That is his specialty. Mm-hmm. Now, what is this man doing as a senior administrator, a flight administrator actually, for NASA during the Apollo program? Well, my thinking is if we look at the Lunar Excursion Module pictures taking off from the moon, what we do not see, I believe, is the signature of a rocket. Hmm. There's certainly a rocket on it. It's certainly firing. You can see this. But it ascends. It just sort of pops off and floats up. Now, a rocket accelerates geometrically. It goes a little further per unit of time. we don't really, in my mind, see that signature. The LEM just immediately accelerates and off it goes. So in other words, I think that we may be looking at an alternative technology, not so much that got us to the moon, but one that got us off the moon. And there is a bit of interesting corroborative evidence, because 2 weeks after the first Apollo moon landing in 1969, Wernher von Braun gave an interview for Time magazine in which he quoted the neutral point of gravity between the Earth and the moon was approximately 43,000 miles from the surface of the moon.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you run the numbers out, if you use the 1/6 gravity figure that we've been told that the moon has, you will end up with a neutral point approximately 23 to 25,000 miles from the surface of the moon, not 43.
Okay.
In other words, that little figure may indicate that the moon has a much higher gravity than we have been told publicly. If it has a much higher gravity, then it is unlikely that the rocket that was on the LEM would have been sufficient to get us off the moon. After all, we required the Saturn V to get us off the Earth.
Yeah.
So it would have been a much more massive rocket than was actually on that ship. So the only other alternative is some form of alternative technology was in play that we have never been told about. We put all these things together, and again, NASA is dissembling.
Okay. I think I'm onto something here. I mean, rather you're onto it, but the lights, when
the light switched on.
Yeah, exactly, precisely. That's right. I mean, okay. And this opens up another can of worms, because considering your research on the Nazis, what they were doing under the war, before and even after, we have paperclip and all this, and what you just mentioned with the idea that they actually might have used a rocket here for a kind of a dummy, basically, and they were actually using some other kind of propulsion system here.
Right.
Okay, so could there potentially be here that the Nazis actually was cooperating with someone during the development of their weaponry during World War II, meaning that either they found something, again we go back to potentially some kind of Roswell incident, crashed UFO, something like that, or they were actually in direct contact with another species, ET. Could that be a possibility here? That they got the technology from, I mean.
I think it is a possibility, and the reason why is that in the Nazi book previous to SS Brotherhood of the Bell, a book called Reich of the Black Sun, I mentioned the case of Benito Mussolini, who had established a very super secret UFO research group under the direction of none other than Guglielmo Marconi. And I find that extremely... He did this, I think, in 1929. So, in other words, it's some number of years prior to the Nazis even taking power.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about this group is, to me, that here we have a clear case, and I reproduced these Italian documents in that book. We have a clear case of a major power that has established a very covert research group to do nothing but study UFOs. And the question is why? And, to my way of thinking, once this is done, and once Italy enters the Axis Pact, I would not be at all surprised if Mussolini had shared some of this information with the Nazis. I have not found any... I've not found any really good, reliable evidence that I can track down or authenticate that any sort of Roswell event occurred either in Italy or inside of Germany. There are rumors, certainly, that something like that happened. But again, I think if it did happen,